Good afternoon, scholars. Thank you all so much for joining us for what is now the last, the last series of what is it called? Ready to Launch workshop series for the semester. We started off a couple of months ago with helping you build your resume. And then we talked about getting you ready to apply for summer research internships. And so tonight we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to talk about applying for graduate school. So as you know, the purpose of the McNair Research Scholars Program, especially here at Delta State, is to get you ready for graduate school. And so tonight's journey is going to help prepare you a little bit more for that. So we're excited that you're here. As you can tell, this is our very first hybrid production. So we hope you like it. And if this is something that you like, we will continue to do these in this manner. But tonight I would like to introduce you to someone who is going to help you along this journey to graduate school. She is probably familiar to a lot of you. Her office is right next door to the McNair office. So you've probably met her or seen her about. She actually holds an associate of arts degree from Hines Community College in pre-nursing. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Mississippi University for Women in public health education. She also holds a Master of Education from Mercer University in higher ed leadership. So you can see there's a thing that's progressing here. And I am happy to share with you that she is currently a candidate for a Doctor of Education degree here at Delta State University, receiving a doctorate of professional studies in higher ed leadership. So I think you will be excited to join me in welcoming this young lady. She's originally from Jackson, Mississippi, and she is currently the Assistant Director of Graduate Admissions here at Delta State. Now that's, kind of her personal profile, but if you get to know her, you will learn that she is a fan of lifelong learning. She is one of the most compassionate people that you will ever meet. And even on days when she is not feeling her best, she will be the most positive person in the room. So please join me in welcoming Sydney Pittman.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so we're gonna get started. First of all, Dr. Taylor's trying to make me cry. But again, my name is Sydney Pittman. I am the Assistant Director of Graduate Admissions here at Delta State University. And so before we get started, I'm gonna click through our little first page here, okay? So of course, some of you all are possibly seniors, correct? I know we have some that are on Zoom. So just want to kind of go over some of the basics with you all as far as applying to graduate school, preparing for a professional degree, and just any type of advance. So before we get started, I do want to tell you guys a little bit more about myself. Of course, you all heard my professional profile here. So I am originally from Jackson, Mississippi. And so a lot of you all have already kind of bypassed looking at colleges as far as undergraduate degrees. And so sometimes, people will ask you, okay, well, what made you choose Delta State? You all are here, okay? And so you may say, well, I like the school spirit of Delta State, or they had my program, things of that nature. So all of, those, those few things is what makes up your reasons as to why you chose an undergraduate degree. In my personal experience, or in my personal life, I am a graduate of Mississippi University for Women, which is on the other side of the state. And so I chose the W, of course. As you all heard, I was a pre-nursing major when I left Hines. And so at the time, of course, the W was one of the top nursing programs in the state. And so that was one of my reasons for choosing it also. But, and I'll say this too, because prior to me coming here at Delta State, I also worked at the W as an admissions counselor. And so in my time, or in my professional experience, I told students, or they asked me, well, what made you choose that institution? And so one of my primary reasons, and one of the things that they laugh about, was the fact that my mom actually attended the W. Okay. And so in her time, or during my time when I was researching schools and institutions, I remember going to that particular college for a preview day, and she came with me. And so did not know anything about the W, just knew that it was one of the top nursing programs. And so I go on campus, my mom is with me, and we're going through all the different sessions, and she's like this light on a Christmas tree, like shining star on a Christmas tree, right? And so I'm sitting here and I'm just kind of looking at her, trying to figure out why exactly is she so excited about this institution, you know? And so I kept asking her while I was there, and she never would tell me. And so after we finished our session and we got back on the road, headed back to Jackson, she finally told me that she attended the W. And so that was another reason as to why I chose that institution as my undergraduate home. And so, of course, we had some funny stories, her telling me about, them having dorm moms, what they called them back then, and stories about them sneaking out of the residence halls and falling in the bushes and things of that nature. So we all have lived experiences on our college campuses. So with that being said, of course, applying to graduate school is a little different. Your experience in graduate school is totally different. So we kind of I'm going to dive into that with you guys today. Okay. So what is graduate school and how is it different from an undergraduate degree? Okay. So graduate school is an advanced course of learning in an academic discipline that prepares students for their career. So it also provides students with an in-depth understanding of what students will become experts in their topic. So of course, you all are pretty much learning the general basis in your undergrad degree as far as things of, general math, science, social studies, those type of things. However, your graduate program is going to narrow things down for you. So say, for instance, if you are a nursing major, right? Typically, students in a graduate program, as you all are learning this in your undergraduate coursework, you all are applying it in your graduate coursework. So that's pretty much the difference. It is more advanced. And so just think of it as if like you were a student in high school, right? And you guys were you were inquiring about what is college like. And so then you realize that college is just an advanced level of high school. Okay, so just think about it that way. Now, before we go to this next slide, I think we have some fashionable people in the room. Anybody like shopping? Kind of, sort of. Okay, so let's think about shopping. And I know you're probably like, what does this have to do with anything? We like shoes, right? Shoes. Okay, so raise of hand. Sneakers. We're a sneakerhead. How many of us like dress shoes? How many of us like certain colors of shoes, right? Okay. So think of applying to graduate school or choosing graduate schools as if you're shopping. And it's pretty much you technically are shopping around. You're trying to figure out what exactly it is that applies to you, what best appeals to you, things of that nature. Okay. So just think of graduate school in that matter. So let's talk about the things that matter as far as graduate schools. So number one, of course, your application. Some students may ask questions as far as, what does your application process look like? How long does it take, or what's the timeline for your application process? One of the things that I want to challenge each of you on is making sure that you ask the question if there are free application events. Of course, you all are McNair Scholars, so you probably would have resources to those things, but don't be afraid to ask those questions. Of course, they want you to ask questions, and in addition, it also prepares you for advanced or professional settings as well. Okay. Also, be sure to ask about application deadlines. That's one of the most important things that you all need to know about. And that's something that also applies to your scholarships. And we'll kind of dig a little bit deeper in that too. Okay. So your program of interest. making sure that that institution has your particular program of interest. That is very important because you're spending your money. Typically, grad schools may or may not offer scholarships. And so you want to make sure that you're getting the bang for your buck when it comes to you looking at certain schools and applying to their programs. Okay. In addition to this, also ask questions about the length of the program, what type of resources are available to students as you all are going through the program, even after the program. And then, of course, making sure that you ask about career opportunities. So typically most schools, or when you go to their website, you will see schools that will have student testimonials. And so they talk about their experience at that particular school, but also where they may land professionally. And so make sure you ask those questions about that. Of course, with you all being a research-based program or being a part of it, make sure you ask about research opportunities, so that way you know that that is something that you can apply in your program of study. Now, this, of course, is a pretty big one, tuition and fees. Of course, we hate the conversation about money unless we're getting money. But just make sure that you ask those questions. That is important. So that way you're on the up and up. Some schools, I know during my process or during my time of me applying to graduate school and going through graduate school, was pretty much the COVID terms. And so a lot of schools did like a tuition freeze. So during the duration of your program, your tuition was at a set cost. So make sure you ask about those things, if there's any incentives, things of that nature, okay? Again, as I mentioned, some schools may or may not have scholarships available to graduate level students, but make sure you ask about those. And if they do have them, ask if they do have any deadlines that you have to meet as far as for your scholarships or GA-ships, GA-ships is your graduate assistantships. It's pretty much the same thing where you're working a job on campus, but you're getting a stipend for it, okay? So it's kind of like a job on campus. Make sure that you ask about program or departmental scholarships. There may be a particular scholarship or grant that may be awarded through whatever program that you're studying. So make sure that you ask that question there as well. Again, career opportunities. This makes a big difference. And I'll kind of touch on this towards the end when I talk a little bit more about my personal experience as well. And I'm sure you guys may have questions too. But make sure that the program that you're choosing or the institution that you're choosing has career options or career conversations that are centered around the things that you're interested in, okay? Housing. So some of you may or may not venture off from Delta State, or if you decide that you want to go somewhere else and you want to look at some other programs, make sure you ask about that, because technically, they say that as you're an undergraduate student, you're stepping into the real world, but graduate school is a different level of real world, okay? And I'll say that because you're in school and you're also working a full-time job, so you have to learn time management and how to balance things out, okay? And so student support platforms, which is one of my last ones here. And so what I mean by that, making sure that those institutions offer you any counseling if you need to talk with someone, health services, tutoring, if there's something that you may need assistance with, make sure that they have those available to you. Some schools also offer peer mentor groups. And so whether it's academic based or just general interest, those things are something that are things that can be available to you as well. Okay, now I want to break this slide here down as well. And so while it says graduate school interview tips, these are things that you can use in your professional setting. So whether or not you're in an interview, whether you're talking in the office with Dr. Taylor or Atlas, just keep in mind these things because of course it will prepare you just in the real world again. So number one, be present. and be prepared. And so what I mean by being present, body language, make sure that you are well groomed on the particular days that you're coming in. You know, of course, what is the phrase that I'm thinking of, y'all? I'm trying to think. Not hygiene, but I was thinking about the fact of, like, you know, dressed to impress, you know, huh? It's first impression. So just think about yourself, like when you're coming into a professional setting, how will someone perceive me? Okay, so just keep that in mind as well. Make sure you take time to read up on the program that you're thinking about and ask questions. What makes this program unique? How does it stand out from other programs? And why should I choose this school or this institution? Okay. Number 2, listen and then talk. And so, of course, make sure that you're engaging with someone who is having a conversation with you. Again, that kind of goes back to the body language, you know, just being present, being available, and just being open. So you want to make sure that you're doing this. Also, in an interview setting, remember that this is a conversation. I know sometimes we'll go into interviews and we're like, okay, we kind of feel we kind of feel like this is an interrogation, right? And so I don't want you guys to go in and see things like that when you're talking to someone of a professional stature. Just be mindful that it is a conversation and just let it flow. You know, they want to know you and get to know who you are as a person. So just keep those things in mind. Number 3, anticipate the unexpected. Okay, so, and I'm sure you guys have probably gone through some of your some interview processes as well. We all hate that question, what is your weakness, right? Okay, and sometimes we don't always know how to answer that question. So just be on the up and up when it comes to those questions like that. Or another question that they ask that sometimes we struggle with is name a time that you failed and how did you conquer that? Okay, so just kind of just make sure that, you know, you don't want to ever be caught on the backside of that question. Always prepare for your interview questions, and sometimes we may just have to go in and sit in our mirror and just kind of talk ourselves through things like that. Okay. Number 4, prepare questions. Just be mindful that sometimes your interviewer will ask you questions, and ask if you have questions, but never say no. Okay. And so in those settings, or whether it's the interviewer or Dr. Taylor or myself, if you don't have any questions in that particular time, just let them know. You know, you can say, I don't have anything right now, but if I do, may I contact you at this particular time, or, you know, after the interview. And typically they will say yes. But you can also gauge if you have any questions based on the conversation that you've had in that particular setting. So just make sure that you kind of express yourself there. Also, number 5, and this is one of the most important ones, don't neglect the little things. And so what I mean by this is making sure that you are well taken care of before you step into that environment, because of course that determines how you will perform. Okay, so I just want you all to know those 5 steps there. I do want to open the floor to you all if you all have any questions, particularly for myself. I know Atlas gave me some questions here, and so I'm going to go over those if you all don't have any questions, but feel free to ask anything. It can be anything in particular to my experience or just graduate school in general. Yes.
What is the most efficient method to find out who is in charge of graduate programs at certain universities and how to contact?
So typically, you will see that in your research as you're going through the websites. I always encourage students to go and also find social media platforms as well, particularly that institution's graduate site. And so that's one way that you can find it. I will say that in my experience, I also had some of my former classmates from the W to share contacts. So make sure that you stay in touch with, you know, some of your classmates. That's another way that you can do it. Word of mouth is always a way that you can find information. Okay, but definitely the website, and utilize the search engine on that institution site as well. I know sometimes some pages may be hard to find that search engine, but be sure to find that or to look for it and utilize that. Type in graduate school, graduate studies, graduate programs, contact page or admissions or things of that nature. So those are typically keywords. Look for those keywords that may navigate you back to that page. That was a great question. Thank you. Sure.
What stuck out to you about the W? Like, do you have any other schools in mind? Like, I know you the mom, but there's some specific you choose other schools.
So I had two institutions that were on my radar at the time that I was applying for my undergraduate degree. And at the time, I was a student that didn't have access to a vehicle and things of that nature. And so I was looking for an institution that offered resources and that made it known, made it available, an institution that was verbal about my safety and just things that spoke to me. And so it varies for different people, but those were the main things that stood out for me, on top of my mom going there and her telling me all her funny stories.
Also, I'm saying you don't go to like science if you're undergrad. Do you think that's true?
I will say yes to that. And the reason why I say yes to that is because typically, and I'll say that I made that mistake. I'll say that. When I graduated from the W, I turned back around and I looked at their their graduate program. And the same instructors that I had for my undergraduate degree were the same instructors that I had for my graduate degree. And even though there are pros and cons to that, the pros is that you know who you're dealing with and the type of instructor and how they navigate their classes and their coursework and things of that nature. But the con is that you're not expanding how you're learning your learning abilities. I'll say that because you know how they're going to teach the class, and you know the things that you're going to have to do to advance and, you know, of course, be successful in that class. So when it comes to exploring other colleges and institutions or just going through different programs, you learn a different structure of learning, but you're also kind of expanding yourself as well. So, yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, what were some disadvantages?
Those that I named primarily were the disadvantages. The same learning structure, I felt like I was in a bubble, pretty much. And so sometimes, you know, once you get out there and you start learning, like you see different ways of learning and different ways that people teach. And so, and I'll say that even in your professional experience, you know, they talk about different generations and how some generations will stay with a particular job for an extended period of time, whereas another generation may give it 3 to 5 years and they're out the door. And so while some do see it as a disadvantage, you're expanding yourself because everybody doesn't teach the same way, they don't learn the same way, they don't deliver the same way. And so those are things that you have to just kind of be mindful of too. So, yeah. And their research, like I know you guys do a lot of research, so their research skills may be different, you know, compared to where you were as far as your undergraduate. So that's another thing too.
If you're applying to like a highly competitive program, what are ways to
So I would say ways for you to stand out in a competitive program would be to make yourself visible. That's the main key that I would stress for a lot of you all, is to make yourself visible. Be on top of communication with your graduate advisor or your academic coach or whoever it may be, your admissions counselor, that's what I was thinking about. But just making yourself visible to them and saying like, hey, I'm very interested in this program, and ask questions, like meet with them continuously, and they will eventually see that you are interested. In you all's undergrad experience, I'm sure you all will hear a lot of your teachers, even Dr. Taylor Atlas, saying, don't be afraid to ask questions. You're making yourself visible in that light for them to say, hey, this student cares about their academic success, and I'm going to assist them to go further. So just be mindful, just think of it that way. That's a great question, Mike. Thank you. Yes.
Just to chime in on that particular conversation.
Mhm.
Per our conversation when we went to the Missouri the McNair symposium, one of the things they said is they help students stand out when they're applying for master's is to pretty much value your credentials and value yourself as a person. They said that they would rather have someone that has probably 3.3 GPA but has pretty much done things in the community and been involved in research or been involved in something that's going to be beneficial in the long run, rather than having one that just a straight A student 4.0 GPA that doesn't have any kind of social interpersonal skills for themselves. So that was like one way they said that you can distinct yourself from like the people that are applying. And another one would be pretty much being involved academically, where like whatever you go for your master's, make sure it's something that you have a clear interest for, not something that you are doing because, hey, I did this, and I feel like this is gonna be for me, when in reality, it's not gonna be something that you want to do for long run. But that's another thing.
That's a valid point. That's very valid.
Are there any resources or websites that you recommend to us for evaluating grad school programs?
I can get back to you on that.
Awesome.
I'll be sure to follow up with Dr. Taylor, and she can share those with you guys too.
I think it's good.
Thank y'all. Okay. Oh, that's Dr. Taylor.
What was the other question?
Resources.
Like,
Yeah.
like selecting like what school will be best for something.
And it also depends on your individual interest too. Yeah. Yes.
If they ask the question, can you repeat it?
Yes.
And I can ask those ones if they had a question.
Okay. But yeah.
I would say like when it comes to like making a program for you. So as everyone probably have already know that I was interested in the University of Alabama applying grad school and things of that nature. But it's like when you begin like the process of evaluating and determining what you want to do, that's why I say pretty much know exactly what you want to do. Before you just go to grad school. So with that being said, I won't be attending Alabama right off for grad school. I'll be going to the postgraduate degree council at another institution being transferred to Alabama for grad school. But upon completion of my undergrad here at that state, I'll be sticking around to get my MBA here.
That's good. And to his point as well, and this is something that some of you probably have heard before as far as when you're applying for undergraduate programs, you hear a lot of people discourage you in a way to say, oh, a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree is something different, or, things of that nature. And so it's, at the end of the day, it's up to you. What works best for you. When I was a student starting my college career, I was not a self-starter. And so going to a 4-year institution was not the best fit for me, which was why I started at Hines. And so, of course, you have people that had their own opinions about, starting at a 2-year college versus a 4-year. But at the end of the day, that was something that set me up for success. And so your success or your path to success may look different from someone else's, but don't let that deter
Those that went to JUCO first.
you.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. It was a great experience. And sometimes we need that, you know. Mm-hmm. That's okay. So did you come straight here to Delta State?
Yes. I did.
Okay.
Northwest didn't get back to me in time,
Okay.
and I didn't like the initial counselor.
Mm-hmm.
She was very rude to me.
Okay.
And here got back to me in time. It's a
Mm-hmm. And that does play a role in your decision as well. Your time or a timeline rather, but also customer service. And so being that we all work in higher education, we know that customer service is a top priority. Not necessarily something on you all's end and making sure that you all receive it as well, but on our end to be the best practitioners that we can be. And so to me, it makes the world go round. So.
Do you feel like there's a time limit between undergrad and graduate school? Like, what if some kids aren't ready to go straight to graduate school and want to take more courses than undergraduate, but they're ready for graduate, not for graduate?
So that's a great question too, because everybody's timeline looks different. Okay. I thought that I was ready to go into grad school as soon as I finished undergrad. And that was a no-go for me. And so I didn't do well because I felt burnt out by the time that I finished with my undergrad. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm jumping back to another program. So sometimes you have to gauge what's best for you. My mom pushed me because she wanted me to be in grad school or get my master's. And so her timeline didn't line up with mine. And so I actually sat out for 5 years before I got my master's. And part of that was also rebranding who I was and what my purpose was. So as you all heard when Dr. Taylor did my introduction, that I had a associate of arts degree in pre-nursing, and then I did a bachelor's in public health education, and then here I am doing a master's and a doctorate degree now in education. And so I had to find my foot. And so while it may be quick for others, it may take a little time for some others. So.
And on top of that, McNair Program stays with you guys for 15 years.
So that's an additional resource that you all have too. So. Huh?
Being a lifetime.
Well,
Y'all get rid of us in 10 years. I mean, I just told y'all I was going to get my master's at Alabama. Yeah, I mean, that's been 10 years. I worked till about 9.
so
Mhm.
stay with that lifetime.
There is a trio on one line that.
Oh.
So we don't just.
Yeah. And that's a good thing. That's a part of you. So that's something that you all will carry, throughout your professional and your academic career. So just be mindful of all your resources that you have. Okay.
One of the things that I would like to encourage you to do, one of the things we talked about with broadcasting before the initial interview, once you get to the point where you're ready to start applying for graduate schools, then come in so we can talk through that, because we want you to take a wide look at your options. You are here at Delta State, and Delta State does have graduate programs. But depending on what you want to do, I mean, who knows, the sky is the limit for you, but we want to make sure that we are able to explore all of that uniquely for you. So it's not going to be, a canned conversation. We're only going to say University of Alabama, LSU. We're not going to do that. It's whatever program you're interested in. So let's sit down and talk about how to get you where it is you want.
And y'all, please start were looking into programs now, don't be like me. I'm gonna graduate, and I'm just not finalizing where I want to go to school with it. So if you have an interest already, or really seek this school into like going on a tour or something, and then like whatever other school and make your decision. Don't be like me, because I went to Alabama one good time and I was already.
You were so. It is. It is.
But I'm ready for a break.
That's okay. That's okay. And just remember that as you're preparing for graduate school, it's an investment. So it's an investment academically, professionally, personally. So just keep that in mind.
So is it different to prepare for graduate school internationally than it is nationally?
We'll let Dr. Gerald answer that.
Yeah.
Well,
That is-
so the grad program I was domestic, but Sydney international, right? Is it different? So it's gonna depend on their admission requirements and their expectations. If, you know, there are a lot of places that, you're gonna work hard at what their tuition is and things like that, because for a lot of schools, or a lot of countries, their citizens go for free. Or almost for free, right? But you won't, right? And some, like, we had a student here, from Denmark. When she came here, Denmark gave her the same amount of money for her education here they would have spent on her there.
What?
Right? Yeah,
Crazy.
isn't it? So the biggest thing is, of course, language is gonna be an issue, right? Language is an issue. You're gonna have to be prepared for that. You're gonna have to be prepared to let go of your Americanness, right? Because there are things that you think everybody does everywhere, and you're gonna find out, even if you just move around the United States, that's not true. Right? It took me forever to find milk the first time I was milk. Yeah, it was in a box on the shelf. It's not refrigerated. And most of the milk we have in the US today that's in the refrigerated section doesn't have to. Right? We just do it because people would freak out here if it wasn't. So, you know, you gotta really be prepared for what that's gonna mean. And you're gonna really wanna spend some time overseas. Now, that said, I didn't. Right? They said, hey, we need you to be in Switzerland in 3 weeks. Could you do that? And I'm like, sure. Right? You know, sold everything I had, went to Switzerland. So my biggest thing on grad school, if you are uncertain about what you want to do, you're burned out. Burnout is an indicator that the program you're in may not be the program.
Amen.
Right? Burnout is more a function of external factors than internal factors. And so if you're feeling burned out in your degree program, it's probably because it's not the one. Okay. And you shouldn't go to grad school in something that's not for you. You need to figure out what's for you before you go to grad school. If, on the other hand, you get to the end of your degree, and you're like, I love this, I'm ready for what's next, go on to grad school while you're accustomed to being poor and eating ramen. Right? Don't go off and get a job and get a mortgage and have a car note and all that kind of expensive stuff, and then say, I want to go back to grad school, because then you can't afford it. Because you got money, right? I mean, think about that. You can't afford grad school at that point because you have money. Right? Because when you have money, you take on obligations that you can't walk away from. Right? Car note, lease, mortgage, things like that. So if you're rocking and rolling at the end of your 4 years, oh yeah, I know what I want to do. Keep moving. If you at the end of the 4 years, you're like, oh, I'm so tired, don't. Right? Take a break. You know, you're going to graduate, you're all going to be what, 22, 23, 21, somewhere in that age range. You know, you are still years away from the prefrontal cortex in the brain, which is final mature stage. Right? Especially young men, years away. And so you're a different person in just a few years. Not completely different, right?
Somewhat.
You're a different person in just a few years. Now I went straight through it. I mean, I was built for academics at the time I was this little. And so it was just fun for me the whole way. It was just fun.
The chuckles are more middle fingers for you.
Yeah, I
Laughing
understand.
at all of the things.
I did not like thermodynamics, and I did not like my second grade English.
By the way, this is Dr. Puerto, he's the dean of graduate studies here at University, if you guys didn't know that.
So my second grade English teacher convinced me I couldn't write. I had to think about that for the longest time. And then at some point I was putting together my resume and realized I'd gotten several writing awards. Right? And none of those had ever triggered. Maybe you're not as bad at writing as the second grade said she was. Right? She didn't like the fact that I started writing long before I got there. And I spelled everything phonetically. And I had my own typewriter. Right? You know, she didn't like that. And so there were issues around that. Yeah.
Emotionally destroy you for years of your life.
Yes. Second grade teachers will do that. Whenever I have a student come to me that's really, really afraid of math, I tell them I hate your fifth grade. No. Your fifth grade math teacher. No. Fifth grade math teacher.
Algebra in the fifth grade.
No, fifth grade math teacher.
We got
Right.
the educations in here.
Because fifth grade math teachers, we know it's the wrong thing to do, but we still try and teach you long division in the fifth grade in the United States. No, it's wrong. And the teachers that are bad at that, and all we have to do is move it until you're cognitively ready in high school.
Yeah, I was.
Oh, yeah, AP course, they define.
AP Big was the only class that took me out.
These would be AP
Everybody else.
Yeah, I had to AP Euro.
Oh, I loved AP Euro.
I loved it, but the work. I couldn't do it. My
It's too much.
So I can
The short
finally
answer is
you all
what
this excited about the graduate.
Now,
Yeah, I did it.
Yes.
one other
You're this excited about it.
one other thing you're gonna have to do, you're gonna have to be coming from small programs. You're accustomed to way more personal attention than most grad students get in big programs. Right? Especially through the masters. And so be ready for that. Right? I didn't know that universities had bureaucracy. You had to process paperwork as an undergraduate. People did that. Right? Then I got to grad school, I was like, oh, there's paperwork. Right? And so there's that. And I still had a lot of privilege as a grad student. There was, I began to run all these bureaucratic things that other students were getting all the time. But all of you have fewer because you're in the McNair program. You get help that other students aren't getting. Right?
It's for you, Dr. Taylor, and Atlas. I like that's like little and Atlas.
Any more?
Yeah, I didn't see anything. Well, of course, I enjoyed you all today. I think my PowerPoint has frozen on me. I think, there we go. So I wanted to share my contact information with you all today, just in case if you do have questions. This QR code will lead you to my LinkedIn account. And so I will challenge you all to create a LinkedIn account if you have not already. If you would like to use mine as an example to structure yours, then you can do so. But any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a phone call. As I tell my office, send me back signals, whatever way that you can get in touch with me, feel free to do so. For those of you that may have already started researching some of the graduate programs, whether it's here at Delta State or if you wanted to start with Delta State, I have created a code for you all to apply for free. So that is specific to the McNair Research Scholars. Okay.
When we graduate next year in the fall, could I apply now?
Yes. Applications are open all the way up until fall of 2027, I believe. But don't wait that long. Because I'm ready to see you.
So the program start, okay, I'm graduating in the fall and I can start the master's in the spring, but would I get funded in the spring? I gotta apply for funding. I already got a job
And where will you be working?
in the College of Business and Aviation.
Okay. Wait, you're serious?
I'm
You're for real?
serious.
Okay. Congratulations.
Oh, well, I ain't told nobody about it because,
That's all.
talk about one for y'all. I went in my room crying because they just kept giving me false information and false hope and everything. But no, it's Joan gave me false hopes and dreams. So
Yes, we will. Well, of course.
Boo, that's Broom Hall, right there on the corner.
Yeah, it's back for this school.
Okay.
Any other questions before we end in the live? Okay. Well, for those of you that are joining us on live, if you all have questions, feel free to shoot me an email or come by the office. We're in Kent White Hall, Suite 239. And so my door is always open and available to assisting anyone. And we appreciate you all for joining, and you all have a great night.
All right.
You too.